origins of the term in the late 19th century, which were in the United States. The original populist movement of the 1880s and 1890s had both a progressive dimension as a farmers' and workers' protest against economic concentration, and an anti-immigrant and white racist right-wing dimension. Both elements were present in the People's Party, which nearly displaced the Democratic Party in 1896 as one of the two major American political parties. The Democratic Party went on to adopt some of the People's Party's program and candidates. Progressive populism, as a popular revolt against extremes of wealth and poverty and against corporate abuses, reached its zenith in the United States during Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in the 1930s and early 1940s, and at the same time, elements of continuing racism in the United States, especially in the American South, reflected reactionary populism. And the American writer John Judis distinguishes in a very useful way, I think, between left-wing populism and right-wing populism. He says, left-wing populism is a two-way conflict between masses and elites, whereas right-wing populism is a three-way conflict between masses and elites and some third party, could be immigrants, could be Jews, who are said to be polluting the true nature of the nation. In any case, in Europe, fascism, of course, gained ground in the 1920s and 1930s to a substantial degree because of the failure of European leaders to pursue a post-World War I recovery program and the inflictions of austerity economics, not just on defeated Germany, but on the continent generally. After 1919, the British in particular, but also the French, tried to restore the pre-1914 system, tried to restore the gold standard, tried to restore the pre-1914 parities of different countries, emphasized debt collection rather than recovery, as was done after World War II. And this led to massive discontent. This led to high unemployment. This led to scapegoating of minorities and ultimately to Hitler and to World War II. And the great book on this, the great prophetic book, is John Maynard Keynes' 1919 book, The Consequences of the Economic Consequences of the Peace, where Keynes literally warned that the onerous terms inflicted by the victorious Allies on defeated Germany would be so awful on the German people that this could lead to a Second World War, which indeed it did. The other great text on this history is Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation, in which Polanyi recounts how the history of the attempt of capitalism to turn everything into a market, rather than leading the workers of the world to unite, as Marx had predicted, led to nationalism and ultimately fascism. And the fascist intellectuals of that era, such as Mussolini's theorist Giovanni Gentile in his book, The Doctrine of Fascism, which was nominally authored by Mussolini himself, but was actually authored by Gentile, or Hitler's favorite theorist, Carl Schmitt, contended that the democracies were doomed because they could neither solve economic problems nor political problems, nor the questions of national identity. And so fascism was built on extreme nationalism as well as authoritarianism. Now, for the most part, the term populism was not used in that era to describe European fascism. The term was fascism. And so if you look at what happens after World War II, the political and economic settlement in Western Europe and the United States was drastically different from what happened.
Bob, sorry to
Yeah,
interrupt. We've lost your screen, Bob. Is your camera? We can't see you. We can hear you, but we can't see you anymore.
that's very strange because I can see myself. Oh, I see. Let me just stop video and start video again.
There
Now,
you are.
okay, I'm
Yes.
so, but
Okay, great.
you thank you for pointing that out. You were able to hear what I was saying, though, right?
Yes, yes, yes.
All right, so let me pick up with where I started a moment ago. And I want to turn now to what happens after World War II, which is in marked contrast to what happens after World War I. It's very interesting that after the defeat of the Axis powers, both the fascist far right and the economic libertarian right had been discredited and politically marginalized. The victorious powers were of the view that mass unemployment in the 1920s and 1930s had been a substantial cause of fascism and then war. So you had no influential political parties anywhere in Western Europe in the post-war era promoting laissez-faire, much less extreme nationalism or authoritarianism. And the post-war European recovery program and the dominant set of policies in the United States blended a kind of managed capitalism with social democracy. Even though the actual program you could describe as social democratic, most leaders of that period in continental Europe were actually Christian Democrats. In Scandinavia and Britain, they were social democrats. And as a way of preventing a future European war, they all promoted full employment, a welfare state, regulation of capital, and steps towards European Union, both as a way of containing Germany within a larger European democratic whole, and as a way of containing nationalism. And in that era, which was one of recovery and increasingly shared prosperity, there was no neo-fascism, or what some today would call populism. Now, in my view, it's a conceptual and semantic mistake to conflate neo-fascism with populism. Fascism has a clear meaning and clear historical antecedents, but the term populism is confusing because sometimes it's used to refer to far-right authoritarian movements, sometimes it's used to refer to reformist, pro-democratic, moderate left-wing movements, sometimes it's used to refer to far-left movement. And unfortunately, what happens is you have commentators lumping something called populism together as if it were all one category as a kind of anti-democratic virus that must be resisted. And I think that confuses more than it clarifies. I would say that Latin America is something of a special case. You have a colonial history, you have weak democracies, you have extensive corruption, and the caudillo tradition of a strong boss. And in Latin America, I think populism can be of the left or the right. It invokes the people against economic and political elites. Sometimes it delivers practical benefits to unions and to workers. I guess the best example of that is Peronism, which is sort of left-wing, but sort of right-wing. It's authoritarian, and yet its popular base is poorer people and unions. But you have other cases like Ignacio Lula da Silva in Brazil, who some people would call a populist, but he's also a very good small d Democrat. So in any case, I want to now turn to neoliberalism. The economic crisis of the 1970s brought neoliberals back to power politically and intellectually. Unemployment increased, so did economic equality. In most of the West, the neoliberal program included tax cuts, deregulation, privatization, weakening of trade unions. And with the creation of the EU, the rules of the EU gave priority to free movement of capital, goods, services, and people, which undermined the ability of the state to regulate capitalism. And then after 1995, the New World Trade Organization sought to enforce rules of liberal trade worldwide. So in these circumstances, the incomes of ordinary working people stagnated or fell, while the incomes of economic elites and their wealth dramatically increased. And you had nominally center-left parties, such as the Democratic Party in the US, the Labour Party in the UK, the German SPD, embracing much of the neoliberal program. And that convergence meant that there was no mainstream opposition party. The only opposition to the centrist neoliberal consensus was on the far right or the far left, and the far left turned out to be very, very weak. The economic crisis that resulted from this deregulation in 2008 raised unemployment rates. The neoliberal leadership governing the EU and the European Central Bank demanded austerity policies, which prolonged the crisis. And then you have the added ingredient of immigration. So in this context, immigration, which was now open throughout the EU, increased both within the EU, and you also had, with the worldwide economic downturn, extra-European migration, both legal and illegal, also increasing, and the mainstream parties had no good solutions. So the worsening economic situation of ordinary working people was in drastic contrast to that of the post-war era, when there was full employment, broadly shared prosperity, little immigration, and no support for the neo-fascist right because the system enjoyed broad popular legitimacy. What happens next? Well, we all know. In the years after 2008, far-right parties gained power, gained support. They became the second largest parties or even the largest parties in much of Europe. In some nations, they have been part of coalition governments. In Turkey, Poland, Hungary, and in the United States, under Donald Trump, the neo-fascist right has governed. And what these parties and leaders have in common is an authoritarian undermining of democracy, the use of anti-foreign and ultranationalist themes, and personalist leadership. And they tend to be disproportionately supported by working class voters who have been the disproportionate losers of neoliberal globalization. And what's really strange is that nominally socialist parties are increasingly supported by the educated and the affluent on the basis of social issues, while far-right parties win the working class vote. So, question, is there a cure? Well, if neoliberalism and globalized neoliberalism have undermined the economic security of ordinary citizens, what's the alternative? There is certainly a far-right version of economic nationalism, but I would argue that there is also a more benign version of economic nationalism that relies on the kind of national economic planning and tighter regulation of transnational capital that we had after World War II during the 30 glorious years in order to restore more balanced economic opportunities. And that would take us back to something more like the tacit social contract of the post-war era. There's a very good description of this in Professor Danny Roderick's book, The Globalization Paradox, which was written in 2011. I don't know why the light in my office just went off. Let me turn it back on. There we go. And lastly, I think there's more than one form of multilateralism. The multilateral system built after World War II laid the foundations for a mixed economy, managed capitalism, of broad prosperity, which in turn inoculated the body politic against neo-fascist tendencies. But the successor system, which began in the 1970s and 1980s, returned the economy to extreme personal insecurity, extreme inequality, which eventually stimulated a neo-fascist backlash. Now, in the United States, where I live, President Biden, surprisingly, has begun moving public policy back towards something more like the post-war social compact, with extensive industrial policies to rebuild domestic supply chains and good jobs. And these policies do violate some of the rules of the World Trade Organization. Just this week, Biden overruled an attempted takeover by Japanese Nippon Steel of U.S. Steel on the ground that having a strong domestic steel company was important to the national security. This completely violates all of the precepts of corporate so-called free trade and the World Trade Organization. And Biden, of course, although he has embraced a kind of economic nationalism, is a strong defender of democracy, and he's anything but a neo-fascist. He's also been an ally of a resurgent trade union movement, which you might say uses populist rhetoric, but against rapacious global corporations. And I would argue that this brand of populism seems to be a necessary antidote to the appeals of neo-fascism and has really nothing in common with it. So with that, I think I should stop and open discussion, and I'm good to be with you for about another 25 minutes.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you so much for jumping in there. So we now come to the portion of our event, the Q&A portion of our event, where everyone will have the chance to field questions to Robert. There's two options, I think. Audience members can either drop questions into the chat and I can direct them, or you can signal your wish to ask a question with a virtual hand and ask him directly. To do that, you can select raised hand from the options below the screen in the Zoom application. Then your name will appear in the participants list, and once your hand is raised, please wait to be called on. Depending on time, and the questions will alternate between those in the chat and those via raised hands. Who would like to ask Robert a question? I have one from Bulent in the chat. In light of your presentation, Robert, how do you foresee a potential return of Donald Trump to power in the upcoming US elections? How do you foresee this affecting the spread and influence of right-wing populism and even potentially neo-fascism on a global scale? What measures do you believe are crucial to mitigate any negative consequences of this trend, particularly in the context of globalization under neoliberal auspices?
I think if Donald Trump were to win the election this November, it would literally be the end of American democracy. He was president for 4 years. It took him about 3 years to really figure out how the system worked. And he had made the mistake of appointing a number of traditional Republicans who were in favor of a far-right economic and social program, but were not in favor of totally destroying democracy. And he's not going to make that mistake again. He's going to appoint, if he's reelected, even more extremist people to be his national security team, to be in his cabinet. And he will figure out how to destroy democracy. And so needless to say, I hope this doesn't happen. He could easily set off a world war. Don't forget, he's very close to Putin. On the other hand, he's very hostile to China. Biden has had a more nuanced approach to China, resisting some of China's economic incursions, but doing everything possible to avoid military conflict with China. So it would be a catastrophe. It'd be a catastrophe for the United States. It would be a catastrophe for the world. And I think the only good news here is that Trump is so crazy that he is undermining his own campaign. He says completely reckless things. I think there's pretty good evidence that he suffers really, and I'm not just saying this rhetorically, from clinical dementia. And the fact is that a lot of people in these Republican primary elections are not voting for Trump. And I don't think they will vote for him in the general election. And happily, Biden, in his annual State of the Union address, showed a lot more energy than he had shown in previous speeches. And yeah, Biden is too old. But I think compared to Trump, I think most people who were inclined to vote for Democrats are going to come back and vote for Biden. So I think the odds, I would never try to make a prediction, but I think the odds are pretty good that Biden is reelected for another term. And then you have to start rebuilding the kind of economy that helps ordinary people, and hope over time that you wean people away from the appeal of fascism.
Thanks, Bob. I'm glad you pivoted to the positive after that rather bleak introduction to that question, to that answer. Ibrahim, please come in with your question.
Professor Kuttner, many thanks for your participation. Nowadays, I am reading two books parallel to each other. One is your book, is Capitalism, a Threat to Democracy. The other one is published by Professor Mordesai Kurz from Stanford University. The title of his book is The Market Power of Technology, Understanding the Second Gilded Age. So very much similar to your perspective. He is also saying that market power becomes a permanent feature of capitalist economy, and therefore technological competition is ineffective, and creative destruction does not restore economic efficiency. Capitalism's strong incentive for innovation and growth, of course, remain here, but the survival of democracy hinges on whether the system's most destructive effects can be contained. My question is that who is going to do that in this world of increasingly more multipolarity? America is unable to do that corporate reform, if you ask me, because of political fragility in the United States. Who is going to be the engine of change then to contain rising authoritarian populism?
Well, it's a very good question. Let me talk about the United States first. And let me go back to this remarkable period, the 30 years after World War II. So in the 30 years after World War II, in both the United States and in Western Europe, you had a very unusual period where the stars were in alignment to regulate capitalism in the broad public interest. You had strong unions, you had a philosophy of regulated capitalism, the system permitted some degree of nationalization, it permitted economic planning. And so the forces that wanted to housebreak capitalism, if you will, that wanted to contain the more destructive tendencies of capitalism, were able to fight capitalism about to a draw. And capitalism was actually more efficient because its destructive tendencies were contained. And it was more legitimate because it was more egalitarian. And I think that got away from us in the 1970s for a variety of reasons. Now, Biden, and I wrote a book about this in 2022 called Going Big, to everyone's surprise, I think because of the COVID epidemic, Biden turned out to be more of a progressive president than anybody thought. And one of the things he did was he appointed very good people to regulatory agencies. So now you have the revival of competition policy and antitrust policy, which had been dead ever since Reagan. Now you have the president of the United States embracing trade unionism, and trade unionism is on the upswing, finally. You have Biden embracing massive public spending to rebuild infrastructure, $5 trillion worth during the pandemic. So I think if Biden is reelected and he can bring with him a Democratic majority in Congress, you can see it turn back to this. Europe is harder. I mean, Europe, the architecture of the EU is neoliberal. And look what happened after 2008, where instead of saying Greece is 1 or 2% of the GDP of Europe, instead of saying, how can we help Greece get out of this horrible situation, the view was, well, let's punish Greece. Greece was too profligate, and so let's punish them by inflicting austerity on Greece. And so it took Western Europe longer to recover from the 2008 collapse than it did take the United States. I don't see very many progressive leaders in Western Europe. Maybe the Labour Party wins the next general election in the UK. UK is not even a part of the European Union anymore. And everywhere you look, France, Germany, you name it, not to mention Hungary and Turkey, it's the right wing that's ascendant. So I think very much as after World War II, if, and I don't say this as an American chauvinist, if we're going to move back away from neoliberalism, paradoxically, the United States, which brought us neoliberalism, the United States is going to have to lead us back away from neoliberalism to something more like a managed form of capitalism and social democracy. Otherwise, I think ordinary people keep feeling that the system is biased against them and neo-fascism keeps gaining.
Thank you, Bob. Louis, you have your hand up, your real hand up. Would you like to come in, sir? Unmute and come in. Have we lost?
Oh, wait a minute.
Oh, there you are.
Okay. I think what the account that you gave is excellent. But I do have a question about the role that the Republican Party played in becoming so narrow and self-serving and so grabbing and so undemocratic that it prepared itself for a tyrant like Trump, and relished in the language of bad behavior, of self dealing, of a gross nature. I describe some of this in my new book called Fighting Better, which tries to give a conflict resolution approach to how to fight. And the Republican Party is an illustration of doing it very badly. And I think Biden is, I agree utterly with what you were saying about Biden, and what he is doing is much more comprehensive also, and is fighting better because he's doing it for the people more widely. I don't know if you, that's partly a question, it's partly an assertion and commentary.
Well, just a quick comment on that. I think you're right about the Republican Party. And, you know, the Republican Party moved further and further to the right, but most ordinary right-wing Republicans were not authoritarians of the sort that Trump is. And then because you had a vacuum where nobody was really standing up for the displaced working class, Trump was able to use nationalism and racism and jingoism in classic authoritarian fashion to surprise everybody and win the Republican nomination in 2016. And then after he got elected, all the other Republicans were afraid of him because the majority of base Republican voters were in favor of Trump. So if you were a Republican and you opposed Trump, you would get beaten in a Republican primary. So they all became cowards. And just 2 weeks ago, the Republicans and the Democrats, in a rare moment of bipartisan cooperation, agreed on legislation to address the crisis at the border. And Trump then put out the word that we don't want to give Biden anything that looks like a political success. So please don't support this bill. And all the Republicans disowned their own bill. That's how much power Trump has over the Republican Party. And you just have to hope that he will be beaten decisively. And interestingly, I think because he's such an original, unusual, charismatic figure, I think if Trump is beaten decisively in November, I think his movement will fragment. There is no obvious successor to Trump. And that's also a little bit of hopeful news. And I have to end on that bit of hopeful news because I have to go teach a class, but I'm really glad this worked out, even in abbreviated form.
Thank you very much, Bob. We really appreciate you rushing in and joining us and sharing your thoughts. It's been fantastic. Thank you very much.
Have a good rest of the session. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Bob.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Simon, I think if all panelists are here, we can start the second panel. I don't know, Anna, what you are thinking about that. You are the moderator. But if they are not here, we have to give a break, maybe. Which one might be better?
I guess probably a short break would make more sense. Would you agree? Yeah, so we keep up with the announced time. Yeah.
Okay. Then we have